Okay, we're back. Today we're going to talk about the process of publication. We've talked a lot about kind of the nitty gritty of what goes into the article, including the introduction and the methods, the results, the discussion. All those components are extremely important. Obviously, they're an integral part to what it is that you're writing. But you also need to know why it is you're publishing, and you need to know a little bit about the process. So we're going to talk a little bit today about publishing, and we're also going to talk about presentation, because often what happens is before your paper gets published or your article is published, you're going to be presenting it to colleagues or to students to get an idea of what they think about your research and your design. A lot of times that is a little bit of a grill session where you're asked questions about what it is that you did, and it helps you to prepare not only further presentation, but it helps you also in terms of how you're writing your article. So this comic was something that I used when I presented to our faculty after I came back from a 3-day seminar on writing and reviewing for scientific publications. And it just goes to show you how difficult the peer review process can be. You may have to go through somewhat of a gauntlet to get your paper published, but there are always reasons of why we publish. So let's take a look. First of all, if there's no publication, there's really no project. In the case of a researcher, it is vital to their success as to whether or not they publish. In many cases, for professors and for moving up and becoming promoted or gaining tenure, publication is part of that process. The research is not done until it's published. So you can't just do the research, collect the data, and then kind of sit on it for years and just let it lie. Or just do kind of, a little talk on it. And if you have good data, you might as well be publishing it. So it's really not complete until that article has been written. It's an opportunity to think more clearly about your work and its meaning. You're taking your work and you're putting it out there into the public eye. And that could be in a trade magazine, it could be in a scientific journal, it could be in anything that people in the community are going to read. It really makes you think a little bit more clearly and concisely about what it is that you're putting on paper. It's also a yardstick of productivity. So, as I mentioned before, promotion and tenure is often a process whereby publication is one of the three things that need to be accomplished. One of the first thing is teaching. The second is committee work, or kind of chairing committees, making policy, things of that nature. And then the third is publication or research. Now, in some institutions, that research is the number one, and most of the time, those individuals are getting money from grants that they write, and that is their salary. They're not paid a salary. That's called soft money. On the other hand, in a teaching institution, although research is an integral part of the entire tenure and promotion process, teaching is paramount. Teaching is number one, and research takes a little bit of a back seat. So even though you're asked to publish, it may not be that you have to publish 3 papers a year. Maybe you have to publish 1 paper a year or 1 paper every 2 years or whatever it is. So it is a yardstick of productivity in many academic institutions. And also it helps you to share the wealth. It helps you to share your knowledge with the scientific community, giving them an idea of what it is that you've done and how what you've done can make a significant impact in that particular discipline. In many cases, as I mentioned before, no publication, no funding. So that is definitely, when it comes to soft money, that's a real difficult thing to deal with. If you're not publishing, you're not going to get funded, and chances are you're going to end up losing your job. Getting grants is one way of doing it. That establishes expertise, but of course, getting grants in today's day and age is quite difficult, as some of the major granting institutions, like the National Institutes of Health, don't grant a very small percentage of papers or proposals that are sent to them for research. And of course, trying to keep the grants is definitely tangible evidence of progress for sure. So if you're keeping grants and you're holding on to 3 and 5 year grants and doing your research, then that definitely is a measure of progress. But all in all, publishing your work is definitely vital to your success. Whether that be in a teaching institution or a research institution, it's definitely a component of what will make you a successful academic. What makes a good paper? Well, there are a few things here. First is you need to demonstrate a defendable experimental design. So we talked about the experimental approach to the problem, and that was the first time I ever saw that was in the National Strength and Conditioning flagship journal, the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. And it's gotten a lot better over the years, but I think one of the big things that it did, and this was probably years ago, 10, 15 years ago, the journal, the organization itself is over 35 years old. The journal is probably somewhere around 20, 25 years old. They added this experimental approach to the problem, which really gave the reader an idea of what was the researcher thinking when he set up this design, and how is this design really impacting his result, his or her result. So I think that's a really important piece. Defending your experimental design is extremely important, and a good paper will demonstrate that. Tells a good story. It needs to have good flow. It can't be like this kind of statico, kind of almost like cut and paste kind of feeling of a paper. It needs to have flow. It should possess clear and concise figures and tables. We talked about figures and tables, and you guys did a great job on that exercise that I sent out, which is how to take data and put it into a table, or put it into a graph, or put it into a line graph, or obviously there's other types of graphs, but those being the 3 major ones. Really understanding where the data belongs so that it's not confusing and that it's visually perceptible is really an important part of this, and clear and concise graphs do a lot for a paper. It advances the understanding of a scientific area, and it adds to the scientific literature that's out there, and suggests possible areas for future investigation. I may have mentioned this before, but of course at the end of a paper, you're always going to kind of I call it lightly slap yourself in the face by saying there was a limitation here, we didn't have enough subjects. There was a limitation here, this equipment was not, was not state of the art. We had a lot of dropouts. Whatever the case may be, there are limitations, and that opens up the door to future research. Future researchers in this area should be examining X. That's always a really great thing to say. One thing is it's humbling because it shows that you're not the almighty of scientific research, but also it points to your colleagues and says, hey, if you want to add to this, this is a great way to do it. So that's a real important piece. Now, the last thing is it possesses a well thought out hypothesis. Remember, everything begins from the prediction, right? So we talk about, like, before you write something, you need to sit down and you need to, number one, we talked about this, you need to really understand the content. You need to understand the discipline, but also understand the research question and what its significance is. And then based on that, you need to come up with a very well thought out hypothesis, because if the hypothesis is weak, then the data that you find, even if you find it in favor, or let's say, rejecting the null hypothesis, if it's a really weak hypothesis, it's not going to mean a lot. So it's very important to have that well thought out and a real strong prediction before you go into your research. Now, the writing order can be different for different people. This is pretty much what I've learned over the years. I used to start with the introduction. So once upon a time, I used to start that way. And it was very difficult because it's like writing a book from page 1 all the way to whatever, page 200. Very difficult in scientific writing. I think the easiest way to start, and a smart and very prolific, very accomplished publisher told me this once, is you start with the methods. And the reason is because if you think about it, the methods are the way that you did the study. It's how you design the study. So you already have that done. You basically just start with the methods. Remember also, one thing I want to point out is before you do any kind of publication, you have had this research proposal approved by a review board of your university or an outside review board. Remember, you can't do any research on human beings without it being approved by a group of individuals who consider themselves a review board. There are many outside review boards you can pay for, but if you work at a university, normally they have a review board built in, and that's what they do. They review the proposals for research that's going to be done by their faculty or their students. So remember, once you've done that, you've put together that application for that review board, you've already written your methods. You take those methods out and you put them into your paper. That's it. Methods done. Okay. Next, the results. Now, the results you're only going to get after you've done the data collection. So you might say to me, well, that's stupid. Why would I write the results second when I'm going to have to wait until I'm done with my research? The point is this: if anything else that comes after the results, such as the discussion in the introduction, the discussion is a discussion of the results. So you're not going to be able to have a discussion unless you have your results. And I do sort of agree that you could write the introduction previous to writing the results, and that's fine. You could do that. But also, believe it or not, the results will also inform the introduction. Because in a way, remember, when you're writing the introduction, you're also using previous data that's been done in this area. And if you knew what your results were, you might have a little bit more of a robust introduction. That does not mean, however, if you wanted to write the methods first and then the introduction, I would say you probably have a good argument to do that, but there's no way you could write the discussion before you find out your results. So if you wanted to flip the introduction and the introduction and the results, that would be fine. So it would read methods, introduction, results, and then discussion. That would be okay. Now the title, you could come up with a title if you want, but chances are the results are going to inform that title, or it's going to give you a little bit more oomph in the title when you have the results. And of course, the abstract will be written as a piece of the actual article, and that will also be informed by the results. Now, it varies by person, but the author that would be considered first in the list of authors might have strong views about writing the introduction after writing the methods. And if you're a student under that individual, then that's what you do. If you happen to be the first author, then it happens to be your choice. So it really depends on what your preference is. But remember, discussion cannot be written until the results are found. Okay, next thing. So you're looking to write this paper. So there's a couple of things you need to be aware of. First is you need to have an outline, right? You need to talk to yourself about what would this outline look like, kind of a skeleton of the paper. So of course you have your introductions, you have your methods, you have your results, you have your discussion, you have your kind of four major components, but then within that, the introduction should have bullet points under it of the main points you want to hit or the main studies that you want to highlight. The method should have the same thing, bullet points of equipment, bullet points of subjects, bullet points under physical space, things like that, things that you want to hit on. Results, bullet points of what the major findings were. Where's the graph going to be? What's the graph going to show? All of that. What's the line graph going to be? Is there going to be a table? And then in the discussion, bullet points of the important salient information that you want to convey that has to do with either agreeing with or disagreeing with work that's been done previously in this area. Authorship. This is an interesting one. I was never a person who, when I did a study with a student, they would always be the first author on that paper. And the reason is because the student would do most of the work. I personally believe, and I'm a firm believer, in the fact of merit. So if you do more work than I do on the paper, and I don't care if I'm more senior than you, you're the first author on this paper. You put in more work, you deserve that first authorship. And the way it normally works is this. First author is basically the author that is most responsible for the paper. They understand everything about the paper, the intro, the methods, the results, the discussion, everything. The authors that come after that individual partially are responsible for the paper, although I will say technically they should be responsible for all aspects of the paper, but really what it is in reality is they did a part of it. So one person maybe did statistics, or the other person helped write the methods and discussion, or the other person helped write the introduction, or the other person helped with the data collection, or whatever it is. They get a piece of that paper, and they're listed as second, third, fourth, fifth, whatever, number author. The last author, however, commonly is the one whose lab that the study was done in. The most senior individual is usually the last individual. Now, if you have two authors, that doesn't necessarily, ring true, but if you have 6 or 7, that's usually the way it works. And that's more for the sciences, like the physical sciences, than other types of research. Maybe economics research might be different, but at least in the physical sciences, that's usually the way it is. And again, like I said, you can be as nasty as you want about authorship, but for me, it's based on merit. Task delegation among collaborators. So now you have to decide before you write this, number one, who's going to be the major author and who's going to be the senior author, whose lab you're doing it in, and then who's doing what. So David, you're going to do part of the introduction, you're going to help me with the methods, and you'll come back in the discussion. Jimmy, you're going to do the results, and you're going to do mostly data collection. Sarah, you're going to do whatever. So everybody knows what their responsibility is before going in. You do not want to have like all of this work done and then go, well, I guess I'll take the introduction. I guess I'll take, it's much better to have it done beforehand. It's almost like a contract with your colleagues. And then that way you have responsibility, you know exactly what you're responsible for. And that, it seems to work out a lot smoother that way. You need to be able to decide on a journal. There are a lot of different reasons why you would choose a journal. You don't just throw a dart at a dartboard at like different journals hanging on a corkboard or whatever and see what you hit. The journal has to be a journal that, number one, publishes either original research or research reviews, depending upon what it is that you're doing. Or if you're writing a comment or you're writing a one-pager, they publish that as well. The journal should be reputable in the field. It should not be Joe's journal that's published out of his garage. And the reason for that is because you want it to be credible when it gets into the scientific literature. You don't want people to look at it and go, yeah, okay, forget it. I'm not even reading that. You want people to really look at it with a little bit of reverence and a little bit of seriousness. You want the journal to also be something that has a fairly high turnover, something that doesn't take 2 years to publish, because by the time you get that thing published, your data is obsolete. So if it can turn around in 4 months or 6 months, you're probably pretty good. You want the journal to be peer reviewed. You want that journal to be something that where your peers are going to be able to read your information and then send you back reviews on it that you can then make edits on and then send the article back to them, right? Send the manuscript back to them for publication. There's a lot of different things. You want also the journal to have a fairly high what's called impact factor. And it basically is a number of the amount of readership that the journal has, because you want to be able to put your article in front of as many eyes as possible. Now, if you're going at impact factors of, let's say, 10 or 15, those are extremely high impact factors. Journals like Science and journals like Nature, the Harvard, what is it called? Harvard's journal, I can't remember the name right now, but there are journals out there that are extremely high impact, but very, very difficult in terms of their acceptance rate. You probably want the journal to have an acceptance rate of somewhere between 25 and 50% of their articles. If they accept 75 or more percent, that means they take everything, including the crap. And so, you want to look for those journals that are kind of in the middle there, that they're not taking everything, but they're accepting those things that they consider to be worthy of their journal. So there are a lot of reasons why you would decide on a particular journal. You also obviously want a journal that's going to publish or has published in the past similar content to your actual research. I also I think it's a good idea to kind of read through these journals, look at the scope of practice, look at what it is that they've published in the past, and that'll give you a very good idea and inkling of what it is that you could publish, where you could publish. Okay, stop and start. Now, stopping and starting is, fine. Obviously, you don't have to write the paper in one sitting, but you do need to gain momentum. Don't start writing the paper and then put it down for 2 months, because you will not remember where you are, and you won't even remember what the data is about, because so many things have happened in that 2 months, it's completely sidetracked you. My advice would be continuously write, but just do it in small chunks. That way, you maintain the momentum, you still have time for the rest of your life, but you're not so completely off track that you don't remember exactly where you left off. And enough data versus too much data. I have an interesting example of this. I went to this workshop, the same workshop that I got the comic from that I told you about. So we went to this workshop, and there were various postdocs from different areas of the country, and they came to this workshop to really learn how to write and review for scientific journals. And we had to bring our own manuscript to the workshop that we had been working on, and then we were broken into groups of about 6 or 7 people, and we had to give a copy to each of those individuals, and everybody read everybody else's manuscript and then reviewed it. I made edits and comments and all of this stuff. And I'll never forget this. This one woman had a really cool research project, and it was very much about like cellular function and proteins and stuff. But it was really neat. And she had she had 13 graphs. So A through, I believe it was J. She had 13 graphs. And it was so much data, we had no idea what it was that she was trying to say. Panel A did this, and panel B did this, and C, and D, and E, and F, and G. It was like ridiculous. It was like 2 pages of just graphs. So you have to think, do I have enough data? Is there enough data to say something or tell my story? And do I not have too much that it's so confusing? So there needs to be a happy medium. In many cases, in journals, you'll see a table for subject characteristics. So that's fine, height, weight, and BMI and all of that. You might see a table for performance indices. You could see maybe 1 to 4 graphs. So often there's like panels, like panel A through panel D. Or you might see 2 bar graphs and a line graph. So maybe there's, let's say, all in total, there's between 4 graphs, there's 4 graphs and 2 tables, or 4 tables and 3 graphs. But that's about it. I mean, you're not like it's not a complete display. Obviously, you need text there, and if you have graphs, you're not writing the same thing in text as you do in the graph, right? The graph is the visual representation, so that's what you want people to see. So you just need to be careful about how much you put in. And I would suggest talking to a mentor or a colleague saying, does this really look ridiculous? Is there too much here? Or is there not enough? I think that would be definitely a fair question. So let's talk about some things to think about. Neither good nor great writing makes up for poor science. Garbage in, garbage out. If there's poor science, doesn't matter how well you write it, it's still going to look like, you know what. But poor writing can mask good science. So what I'm trying to say here is that if you have a poor scientific proposal, a horrible hypothesis, your data looks like crap, you could be the most amazing writer in the world, and it's not going to make up for it. But if you can't write for your life and you have amazing data, then that's going to mask the good science that you have as part of your paper. So be careful and understand how to write scientifically, and the best way that I can tell you to do that is start reading research articles. It's very formulaic. It's very kind of, as I said, similar with the 4 components in the research article and how it's broken down, but there is a method to the writing. So take a look at research articles and try to try to involve yourself in understanding how they write. If you have questions, please feel free to contact me. I have great slides on that stuff, and I can help you as well. Talking you through it. Okay, plan early on before the experiments begin. So always have a plan before your experiments begin. Remember, the first thing that you're writing out is your methods, and that is how you did the research study. So if you can make a plan before your experiments begin and have everything down pat, then you're in a much better place. Discuss details with collaborators. So if you are collaborating with individuals, understand the nitty-gritty details of the proposal, of the methods. You need to understand it backwards and forwards, and practice, practice, practice before you actually go through with your research. So you may practice on a colleague. If you're using new equipment, learn how to use the equipment so that when your first subject shows up, you're not sitting there for 50 extra minutes and trying to go through the research project, because they're going to get frustrated and they're going to walk out, and then you've just lost a participant. So you really need to know exactly what you're doing, be very focused, understand how to run your methods, and therefore the data you collect will be very clean. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about presenting your research. We talked a little bit about writing it. Let's talk about presenting it. The first thing I think you need to be aware of is your timing. How long is your presentation? Is it a 5-minute presentation, a 45-minute presentation? If it's short, then focus on the most salient points and be done with it. That's it. If it's longer, like 45 minutes, like you have at many conferences, then now you're going to be presenting additional detail, right? Supporting detail, whether that be looking at previous work that's been done and pulling in a graph from that previous work, whether it be detailing your actual methods and really getting into the kind of nitty-gritty of how you did it and how it's different from, people who did it before. So it really depends on how long that talk is. Time yourself giving the talk. You'll notice that in PowerPoint and Keynote, they now have, I don't want to say now have, it's always been there, but you can use a rehearsal component which allows you to rehearse your talk. It times you, and it's an excellent feature. It's a really good practice tool. Make any cuts if you need to, and try to end a bit early. So if your talk is 45 minutes, try to end at 40 or before that if you can, giving yourself at least 3 to 5 minutes for questions and answers. Going over time shows a lack of preparation. So if you're talking in very tangential, and you're going off the track and you're going off on these like other thoughts, you're going to go overtime. And then once you do that, there will be no time for Q&A, and that next person will be waiting there to get up on stage and give their talk. So it's important to be considerate. Try to end a bit early, and you'll have much more time for conversation at the end of your talk. You need to know who it is you're talking to. Who's the audience? So depending upon the audience, you're going to find much different things. So let's say you're giving a very technical talk, but you're talking to a community center. They're not going to know what you're talking about. So you need to then stay away from the jargon. You need to bring it down. You need to bring the technical aspect of it a little bit more into layman's terms. You need to discuss more the general idea than the technical aspects. But now if you're talking to your colleagues, whether it be medical, whether it be like allied health or technical, now you can bring in the detail, right? Because they're going to understand everything that it is you're talking about. So it's very important to know who you're talking to, and to also not just the audience, but put yourself in their shoes and understand their level of education, not in general necessarily, but their level of education in regard or in relation to what you're talking about. And maybe ask yourself what educated people not in your field would know. That might give you a little bit of guidance of how to go about your talk. And if there are terms that are unfamiliar, and you can read people sometimes, in an audience, if it's a small enough audience, you can read them, define any terms that might be unfamiliar. And try to make an effort to explain the significance of your research in a way the listeners would understand. Again, if it's general population community center, what is the big picture here? What is something that everybody gets? If it's not, if it's more technical, then how is it going to impact our discipline? How is it going to impact our scientific literature? Be a little bit more pointed with your commentary. Okay, let's talk about the content. It's always better to think about big picture rather than focusing on the details. When you focus on the details, when I say focus on the details, I mean make your entire presentation about details. When you do that, you're going to get lost in the sauce. I think it's better to show some details and relate it to bigger picture items as opposed to just giving them details. A couple of things you can do also with your content. Number one, look into the past. So why is it that you're doing your research? What was something that made you interested in the topic that you're presenting? And why is it that you started asking the questions you asked? So where was the gap in the literature? How did you find it? And why did you ask this particular question? Why is that important to you? Then go into the future. What will you remember as the most interesting or compelling thing that you learned from your research? And I think this really speaks to the significance of the research, right? So how is it going to impact the scientific literature? What's the most compelling thing you learned? Now, if the most compelling thing you learned was you didn't understand how to use the new blood pressure equipment, that's really not what the audience is there for. They're there basically to find out, number one, why did you ask the question? Number two, when you asked the question and you got the answer, what was so interesting about the answer? And how can we move that answer forward in future research? Were there any surprises or pitfalls? So was there anything that came up that you had to deal with? And talking about that can be very helpful to researchers because if someone's going to be using similar methods as you, they need to know what it is that they can expect. And then you're ready to ask yourself, what are the points that I need to convey? What are the major points I need to convey? So again, look into the past. Why did you get interested? Why did you ask that question? Move into the future. What are you going to remember from what it is you did? What are the pitfalls or surprises? And then start now discussing your content and really here are the main points that I want you to get out of this presentation. Be organized. There is nothing worse than a disorganized presenter. Horrible. You feel bad for them. So you need to be organized. Now, often we have our stuff on a flash drive or on our computer and helps things to be organized. However, when your slides are all over the place, it's horrible to listen to a presenter like that. So the first thing you need to do is introduce yourself. Who are you? Where are you from? A little bit of your background. Always nice to do that, especially if you're in front of a big room. Present your research question and why it matters. Number one, why is this the research question you chose? And why does this research question in particular have a significance in the science that you're presenting or in the discipline that you're working with it? Describe how you conducted your research, of course. Talk about your methods. And again, if it's a longer talk, you can go into detail. If not, then you can give a little bit of a bigger picture about your methods. Explain what you found out and what it means, why it's significant, what the impact might be, and then conclude with a summary of your main points. What are the take-home messages here? People love the take-home messages. Here's the take-home. Take these home. Here's 4 bullet points. This is what's important about this research, and this is how we can move the research forward in the future. Be judicious in the amount of information you give, and do not let this discussion get you off track. So you can be judicious in the amount of information you give. That's fine if you have the time. You need to be very kind of cognizant of the amount of time that you're given, but don't let the discussion get off track, right? So you can't be too tangential, as I mentioned before. You can't be talking about stuff that is related kind of on the periphery. You need to stay focused. Bring the focus back to the research. Remind the audience of your research question constantly. Remember, your research question is really what kind of, in a way, birthed your hypothesis, right? It's the way that you got your hypothesis from your research question. So you need to bring it full circle. You need to bring it back to that. The audience will appreciate that. Do not even think of opening a PowerPoint until you've organized your ideas and decided on your main points. Don't write your PowerPoint while you're writing your presentation. Write your presentation first, then build your PowerPoint after you've done that. And we're going to talk specifically about PowerPoint now. PowerPoint started, it's probably 25, 30 years, I don't know. It's got to be over 20 years old. I was using PowerPoint in graduate school. I was 25, I'm 49, 24 years. It's got to be somewhere around 30 years old at this point. And it was an amazing advent. It was an incredible thing to be able to use a visual to convey your points. But what's happened is people have started to now use PowerPoint as a crutch. And you'll know exactly who they are when you watch them present. So a couple of things you can do with PowerPoint and not use it as a crutch. Number one, incorporate images. The visual image is so powerful to convey a message, if it's done correctly, that no words need to be said. Everybody can see what it is that you're looking at. If you want to basically support what it is that you're visually presenting, that's fine. But using PowerPoint for those visual images is an excellent idea. You can emphasize important points. Sorry about that, guys. You can emphasize important points. Meaning you can highlight them. You can make them red. You can make them bold white. You can do whatever you want, but you emphasize them. And one thing that does is for the audience, it makes them pay more attention to that point. And for you, it gives you guidance into, giving kind of bolstering that point. It's really, that point's important. That's the take home from this particular slide. And you can guide your audience in following your argument. So it presents your story in a visual manner. So here's some do's and don'ts of PowerPoint. Okay, first one, do. Explain what each chart or graph indicates. So support the chart, but use the chart as that kind of visual imagery that conveys the message. Really important. Don't present too much information on slides. I don't know if you've ever seen slides that are extremely busy, but it is extremely hard to read them. Even this slide right here, the PowerPoint do's and don'ts, the spend extra time bullet point, I probably could have cut that down, and that's a little bit too crazy. Also, the do's and don'ts could be kind of centered so they don't look like a bullet. There are various ways of kind of visually presenting this a little bit better. But for the most part, you could pretty much read everything on this slide. It's not that busy. So try not to make your slides too busy. Use charts and graphs to convey information clearly. Again, like I said, a good chart, a good graph is going to do wonders for your audience. Prepare to give your talk even if technology fails. We're going to get back to that. Don't spend extra time on making fancy PowerPoint presentations with transitions, and this is not a birthday party. It is not an anniversary where you're showing 50 pictures of Jim and Sally's life and you want the cube rotating with the transition and it's great, and here's a picture of them in the Grand Canyon, here's one of them in Paris. That's not what this is. This is a scientific presentation. No need to spin your slides, make things fall out of the sky. You don't need to do that. A dissolve works beautifully. It's very nice. It takes a couple of seconds to come up, gives the audience a moment to kind of read the bullet, and then the next dissolve comes up. That's more than enough. So try not to get too fancy. The other point I want to get back to, prepare to give the talk even if technology fails. Make sure you have a copy of your slides. Whether it be 1 slide per page, 9 slides per page, I don't care. There's been many times where technology has not worked. Usually at conferences, they're pretty prepared. But if you're doing a slide presentation in a community center, at a school, and their PowerPoint and their slide project, whatever it is, their slide system is not working, you're screwed if you don't have a copy of your slide presentation. Not only that, But you need to practice your presentation so that even if the technology fails, you can still give it like with no problem. We'll get back to that in a moment. Tone. Approach your talk as a somewhat formal occasion. It is somewhat formal. I mean, even though you might be speaking in Orlando and people are in shorts and t-shirts and just came from the pool to your, to the room in the conference you're at, it's formal. You're going to probably be in a jacket and tie or a dress or whatever it is that you're wearing that shows that you are professional, that you're serious about it. You need to kind of conduct yourself that way. Treat your audience and your topic with respect. That goes for Q&A as well. If someone asks a question that you think is the dumbest thing you've ever heard in your entire life, don't say, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard in my entire life. Of course not. Say, okay, I understand your question, but I would answer it this way. Or our data show, blah, 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 whatever it is. So treat the audience and topic with respect. Even if you know everyone in the room, please introduce yourself. Very important, very professional to do so. Don't address audience members as you guys or yous guys or hey you. If someone has a question, the gentleman in the back has a question. Okay, he raises his hand, he steps up to the microphone, he asks a question. That was an excellent question. Let me address that in 2 ways. And then you go through whatever it is that your answer is. Remember, be very professional with these people because these people may be hiring you in the future, or you may run into them again in a professional setting. And be passionate about what it is that you're actually saying. So have a little bit of enthusiasm. Don't trail off at the end of your sentences. Don't talk. You don't mumble. Talk out loud. Talk like you know what you're doing because you've practiced this presentation. You understand it. You've done the data collection. This is your research. Be passionate about it. And not only be passionate about the research, but be passionate about what the research shows, what its impact is, what the significance might be, and then what other people could do in the future to drive the research forward. That's the most exciting part about it. Lastly, practice. Number 1, practice speaking slowly and clearly. If you want to emphasize an important point, repeat it. Don't practice speaking slowly and clearly. If you want to emphasize a point, repeat it. Don't read and talk and speak out loud enough times and then you know where you're at points and you can't understand anyone like that. I understand that you get nervous when you're doing a presentation, especially in front of many people. And these could be colleagues, they could be people who are pretty high up in the scientific, on the scientific ladder. But you know what? They're here to hear you talk. You know your stuff. Speak slowly and speak clearly. If you want to emphasize the point, then repeat it. Don't read your talk. Don't show up with index cards and sit there and read the talk. Don't do that. Speak out loud enough times so that you know when there are points that tend to trip you up. All right? So, in other words, what we're saying is practice the talk, but don't read it. If you speak it out loud enough times, you'll know exactly where those points are that you need to kind of focus on a little bit more. This part kind of always gets me confused, whatever it is. Maybe change the slide, change the bullet, change the way that you're saying the sentence, whatever it is that's not going to trip you up. And where you might have a tendency to throw in something new and get off track, and whether there's some of your transitions are not smooth enough. Again, speaking out loud will help you. If you tend to go tangential on one of the points, then speaking out loud will help you to kind of curtail that or shorten it. Now, you may want to tell a story. Let me tell you a story about this point. I have something very interesting to say. A story of one of my colleagues about 5 years ago, blah, 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 blah. You tell your story, you pull it right back to the point. So when you're speaking out loud and not reading it, you understand where you're smooth and where you're rough, and then you can make those adjustments. And of course, time yourself. As I mentioned before, rehearse. Use the rehearsal component of either Keynote or PowerPoint. It can be very helpful. Make any cuts if you need to, if the presentation is going on too long, and just practice. Constantly practice. If you're in a hotel room, at a conference, pace that hotel room, practicing over and over and over and over so that when you're doing it, it's a piece of cake. The practice is the hard part. The presentation should be easy. If you get nervous, which you may, a couple of tricks. One is obviously taking deep breaths can help. Two is visualizing everyone in their underwear, which you may have heard of. Many years ago they used to say that, although that doesn't really help and can be very what would the word be? It could be very disturbing at times. But what you could do is you could kind of just almost meditate on the presentation. So speak the presentation in your mind. So practice it enough that you know it and that you know your slides. And that way, when you go out there, this is already in your subconscious and it's just kind of coming out. It's not like you're doing it for the first time where you're voluntarily speaking. You're kind of just involuntarily, it's just kind of flowing out of you. I know that sounds esoteric, it might sound a little kooky, but it does help. Short of taking beta blockers and slowing your heart rate down, which can also make you faint, you could perform a little bit of a Valsalva maneuver, but again, if you don't do that correctly, bearing down to slow your heart rate down, that could have kind of unintended consequences. So you may not want to do that. But I think taking deep breaths, really practicing, really knowing what it is you're going to say, and then also meditating on the actual presentation can be very helpful. So, thanks for hanging with me for a little over 45 minutes. I appreciate it. And I hope you got a little bit out of writing for scientific literature and also presenting your research once it's done. I'm going to be signing off now. I believe we have one more presentation, and I will see you then.